Sometimes the hardest battles we fight aren't against enemies, but against the bitter cold of isolation when everyone we love has turned away. Picture a grandmother, cast out from her own people, watching her grandchildren grow weaker in a frozen cave while winter shows no mercy. In 1885 New Mexico territory, Tahoma faces every parent's worst nightmare with nothing but her fierce love and fading strength. Then a lone wolf appears at her cave. Most would see danger, but Tahoma sees something else. She sees hope. This wolf doesn't just lead them to safety, it leads them to a choice that will change everything. What happens when survival means trusting the very wilderness that's trying to kill you? Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from. And if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow I've saved something extra special for you. The wind howled through the canyon like the spirits of the dead, carrying with it the promise of another bitter night. Tahoma pulled the thin blanket tighter around her grandchildren, feeling their small bodies shiver against her own weathered frame. At 48, she had survived droughts, raids, and the heartbreak of watching her people adapt to an ever-changing world. But nothing had prepared her for this. Sitting in a shallow cave with 2 orphan children, watching death creep closer with each passing hour, Ayana, 8 years old with her mother's gentle eyes, pressed against Tahoma's left side. The girl had stopped complaining about hunger 2 days ago, a silence that worried Tahoma more than any tears. On her right, 6-year-old Nalnish lay curled like a sleeping fox, his breath coming in small puffs that hung in the frigid air before disappearing into the darkness. These children were all that remained of her daughter's brief but passionate life, and Tahoma would not let them slip away into the spirit world, not while she still drew breath. The small fire at the cave's mouth had dwindled to glowing embers, fed by the last scraps of sagebrush and dried grass they had managed to gather 3 days ago. Beyond the orange glow, snow continued to fall in thick, heavy flakes that promised to trap them even deeper in this frozen tomb. Tahoma reached for the beaded leather pouch that hung around her neck, her daughter's medicine pouch filled with herbs that could ease pain and fever. But herbs meant nothing when there was no food to give the children strength, no wood to feed the fire, no hope of rescue in this desolate place. How had it come to this? The question had haunted her for months, ever since the tribal council had spoken their verdict with cold finality. Exile. The word still burned in her chest like a hot coal. She, Tahoma of the Mescalero Apache, daughter of warriors, keeper of the old songs, had been cast out like a diseased animal, not for her own crimes, but for defending her daughter's choice to love beyond the boundaries of blood and tradition. Maria had been barely 19 when she met Diego Morales at the trading post near Ruidoso. The Mexican trader was kind, honest, and spoke Apache with a careful respect that impressed even the elders. But he was not Apache, and in the turbulent years following the wars with the white soldiers, such unions had become forbidden, dangerous bridges that could lead enemies straight to the heart of the people. When Maria announced her intention to marry Diego, the council forbade it. When she married him anyway, in a small ceremony blessed by a traveling priest, they declared her dead to the tribe. Tahoma could have accepted her daughter's choice and maintained her own place among the people. The elders had made that clear. Disown the girl, they said, and return to your honored position. Teach the young women, keep the sacred stories, live and die with dignity among your own kind. But when they came to take Maria's newborn children, declaring them corrupted by Mexican blood, Tahoma had stood in their path like a mother bear, protecting her cubs. These babies carry the blood of our ancestors, she had declared, holding tiny Ayana while Maria clutched newborn Nalnish to her chest. They are Apache, no matter who their father might be. Would you steal children from their mother's arms because of fear? The council's response had been swift and merciless. Maria, her husband, and their children were banished. Anyone who chose to follow them would share their fate. Tahoma had looked around the circle of faces she had known since childhood, faces now turned hard as stone, and made her choice. She gathered her few possessions and walked away from the only home she had ever known. For 2 years, they had lived well enough on the outskirts of Las Cruces, where Diego's trade in wool and silver provided a modest but steady income. The children thrived, learning Spanish and English alongside the Apache words their grandmother whispered to them each night. Maria bloomed as a wife and mother, her laughter filling their small adobe house with warmth that no fire could match. They were building something new, a family that honored the past while embracing the future. Then the fever came. It started with Maria's complaints of tiredness, which they dismissed as the natural exhaustion of a young mother. But within days, she was burning with heat that no amount of cool water could ease. Tahoma tried every remedy she knew: willow, bark tea, steam baths, prayers to the mountain spirits, but the sickness was stronger than all her knowledge. Diego rode hard to fetch a doctor from Las Cruces, but the man arrived too late. Maria died holding Tahoma's hand, her last words a whispered plea: "Keep them safe, Mama. Keep them Apache." Diego grieved like a man whose soul had been torn from his body. For weeks, he wandered through their small house like a ghost, unable to eat, unable to sleep, unable to look at his children without breaking down. Tahoma cared for Ayana and Nalnish, telling them their mama had gone to dance with the stars, but she watched Diego with growing concern. The man was drowning in sorrow, and she feared he might not find his way back to the land of the living. Then, one morning, she woke to find him gone. He had left a note written in careful Spanish, apologizing for his weakness and promising to send money when he could. The children kept asking when Papa was coming home, and Tahoma found herself lying, with gentle words that grew more hollow each day. After 3 months without word or payment, she realized Diego wasn't coming back. Pride had kept her from seeking help from the Mexican families in Las Cruces who might have taken in the children. These were her daughter's babies, her blood, her responsibility. She sold what few valuables Maria had owned: a silver necklace, a hand-carved wooden cross, some embroidered cloth, and used the money to buy supplies for a journey north into the mountains. If the tribal council could see how well she had cared for the children, perhaps they would reconsider the exile. Perhaps there was still a place for them among the people. The journey had started well enough in late autumn, when the children were still strong and the weather held. Tahoma knew the mountain trails from her youth, when her father had taught her to track deer through these same canyons. But the early winter had come with unusual fury, trapping them in the high country before they could reach the lower elevations, where her people made their winter camps. For 3 weeks, they had moved from shelter to shelter, eating what small game Tahoma could trap and sleeping in caves when the wind grew too fierce for travel. The children had been brave, trusting their grandmother's knowledge and wisdom, even as their bellies grew empty and their small bodies grew thin. But yesterday, when Nalnish had collapsed in the snow and been unable to rise, Tahoma knew they had reached the end of their strength. Then a low growl came from just beyond the dying light of their fire. Tahoma moved slowly, careful not to disturb Ayana and Nalnish, and reached for the hunting knife that had been her father's. The blade was old but sharp, and her hand knew its weight and balance as well as her own heartbeat. The growl came again, closer now, followed by the soft crunch of paws moving through snow. When the wind shifted the flames, she saw it clearly. A wolf stood at the edge of their small circle of warmth, its golden eyes reflecting the firelight. Like twin stars, it was large for its kind, with a coat of grey and white that seemed to shimmer in the dancing shadows. But what struck Tahoma most was not the animal's size or beauty. It was the complete lack of fear in those ancient eyes. Her father's voice echoed in her memory. "When you are lost, daughter, look for the signs the spirits send. They may come, wearing fur or feathers, but they will always come when the need is greatest." The wolf took a step closer to the fire, and Tahoma tightened her grip on the knife. But instead of the attack she expected, the animal simply sat down in the snow, close enough that she could see the steady rise and fall of its breathing. It made no threatening moves, showed no signs of hunger or aggression. It simply watched, as if waiting for something. Minutes passed in this strange tableau: dying fire, sleeping children, exhausted grandmother, and patient wolf. Tahoma felt her fear gradually transform into something that tasted of hope and old stories. When Ayana stirred against her side, murmuring in her sleep, the wolf's ears pricked forward with what looked almost like concern. That's when Tahoma knew. This was no ordinary animal driven by hunger or curiosity. This was a sign, a gift from the spirits who watched over children and fools. Tomorrow, when the choice between staying and going became impossible to avoid, she would have an answer. The wolf remained there until the fire burned down to ash, then rose gracefully and padded back into the darkness. But before it disappeared completely, it paused and looked back at Tahoma one final time. In that gaze, she read a message as clear as words spoken aloud: "Follow me." Dawn came grey and bitter, the kind of morning that promised no mercy from winter's grip. Tahoma woke to find frost covering the inside walls of their shallow cave, her breath forming clouds that lingered in the still air. The fire had died completely during the night, leaving only cold ashes and the memory of warmth. Beside her, Ayana and Nalnish lay so still that panic seized her heart until she saw the faint mist of their breathing. The children were alive, but barely. Nalnish's lips had taken on a blue tinge that spoke of his body's struggle against the cold, while Ayana's eyes, when they fluttered open, held a distant quality that frightened Tahoma more than any fever. They were slipping away from her moment by moment, and she had nothing left to give them: no food, no fuel, no hope of rescue in this desolate canyon. "Grandmother," Ayana whispered, her voice barely audible above the wind that moaned through the rocks above them. "I dreamed of Mama last night. She was warm, and she had food for us." Tahoma's throat tightened as she smoothed the girl's dark hair. "What did she say to you, little star?" "She said we should follow the wolf. She said it would take us home." Ayana's eyes focused with sudden clarity. "There was a wolf here, wasn't there? I thought I heard something during the night." Before Tahoma could answer, a sound from outside the cave made them both freeze. Not the howl of wind or the crack of ice-laden branches, but something else: the deliberate crunch of footsteps in snow. Heavy, careful steps that spoke of something large, moving with purpose through the drifts that blocked their view of the canyon floor. Tahoma reached for her father's knife, the blade singing softly as it cleared the worn leather sheath. Whatever approached their cave, she would face it standing. She would not let death take the children while she cowered in the shadows. But when the shape appeared at the cave mouth, silhouetted against the grey morning light, it was not the bear or mountain cat she had expected. The wolf stood there, larger than she remembered from the night before, its thick coat dusted with snow and its golden eyes fixed on her with an intensity that made her hand tremble on the knife handle. "The wolf," Nalnish breathed, somehow finding the strength to lift his head from the blanket. It came back. The animal took a step into the cave, close enough that Tahoma could see the individual whiskers on its muzzle, the small scars that marked it as a survivor of many battles. But there was no threat in its posture, no hunger in its gaze. Instead, it looked at each of them in turn, grandmother, girl, boy, as if taking measure of their condition and finding them worthy of something. Then it did something that made Tahoma's breath catch in her throat. The wolf padded to the back of the cave where their meager supplies lay scattered, sniffed once at the empty water gourd and the torn remnants of their last blanket, then returned to the cave mouth. There it sat, facing outward toward the canyon, and released a single piercing howl that echoed off the stone walls like a call to prayer. "It's telling us to follow," Ayana said, with the simple certainty of a child who had not yet learned to doubt her instincts. "Just like Mama said in the dream." Tahoma looked at her grandchildren, at Nalnish's labored breathing and Ayana's hollow cheeks, and felt the weight of an impossible choice settle on her shoulders. Stay in the cave with the last scraps of warmth and die slowly together, or trust their lives to a wild animal, and almost certainly die faster in the open snow. Either path led to the same destination, but one offered the illusion of hope. The wolf turned its head to look at her, and in that golden gaze, Tahoma saw something that made her decision for her. This was not a random encounter. This was the answer to prayers she had been too proud to speak aloud, the sign her father had taught her to recognize when the spirits chose to intervene in the affairs of mortals. "We follow," she said, the words coming out stronger than she felt. "Gather what we can carry. We leave nothing useful behind." There was little enough to gather. The cracked water gourd that might yet hold a swallow or two of precious liquid, her father's knife, the medicine pouch that had belonged to Maria, a handful of roots she'd been saving for the most desperate moment, though surely this qualified. She wrapped these few possessions in what remained of their blanket and fashioned a crude sling across her shoulders. The children were weaker than she had feared. Ayana could stand and take a few wavering steps, but Nalnish collapsed when he tried to rise, his small body trembling with exhaustion. Without hesitation, Tahoma lifted the boy and settled him across her shoulders, ignoring the protest from her own tired muscles. They would move as one, or not at all. The wolf watched these preparations with what seemed like approval, then turned and began walking down the canyon, its paws finding purchase on surfaces that looked impossible to navigate. It moved with the confidence of an animal that knew exactly where it was going, pausing every few steps to look back and ensure they were following. The first hour was torture. Every step sent jolts of pain through Tahoma's legs as they broke through the crust of snow into the deeper drifts below. Nalnish seemed to grow heavier with each passing minute, though she knew it was her own strength that was failing. Behind her, Ayana struggled gamely forward, her small hands clutching at Tahoma's coat to keep from falling behind. But the wolf never let them fall too far back. When the distance between them grew too great, it would stop and wait, sometimes sitting patiently while they caught their breath, sometimes circling back to check on their progress. There was something almost human in its attention to their needs, as if it understood the limitations of their kind and was adjusting its own pace accordingly. By midday, they had traveled farther than Tahoma would have thought possible in their condition. The wolf had led them down from the high canyon where they had sheltered, following game trails that wound between towering red rocks and through groves of stunted piñon trees. The lower elevation brought a slight warming, not enough to melt the snow, but sufficient to make breathing easier and walking less treacherous. More importantly, the wolf had led them to water. Not much, a thin trickle that seeped from a crack in the rock face and pooled in a natural basin before continuing its journey toward lower ground, but enough to fill the gourd and ease the burning thirst that had tormented them for days. They drank carefully, savoring each precious drop while the wolf waited nearby with what looked like satisfaction. "Where is it taking us?" Ayana asked during their brief rest. Her color was better after the water, though her eyes still held that glassy quality that spoke of fever. Tahoma studied the landscape ahead, trying to read the signs her father had taught her to recognize. The direction was roughly northwest, toward the lower country where winter would be less severe, but that told her nothing about their specific destination, or whether such a destination even existed. For all she knew, they were following a wild animal toward their own deaths, drawn by desperation into trusting something that knew nothing of human needs or limitations. Then she saw it, a thin column of smoke rising from somewhere beyond the next ridge, pale gray against the overcast sky. Not the smoke of a wildfire, but the controlled burn of a human fire, tended by hands that knew the value of conserving fuel in winter. The wolf had seen it too. Its ears pricked forward, and its tail gave a single, measured wag before it resumed walking, this time with increased purpose. Whatever lay ahead, their guide knew about it and approved, but approval from a wolf was a far cry from safety for two half-starved children and their exhausted grandmother. Tahoma adjusted Nalnish's weight on her shoulders and checked to make sure her father's knife was within easy reach. Trust was one thing, foolishness was quite another. As they crested the ridge and looked down into the valley below, Tahoma felt her breath catch. In a sheltered hollow between two arms of red stone, she could see the outlines of buildings, not the temporary shelters of nomads, but permanent structures with walls of adobe and stone. Smoke rose from several chimneys, and she could make out the shapes of people moving between the buildings, going about the business of daily life, even in the depths of winter. The wolf had led them to civilization. Whether that meant salvation or simply a different kind of danger remained to be seen. But as Nalnish stirred against her shoulder and Ayana pressed close to her side, Tahoma allowed herself the first real hope she had felt in days. In the snow at her feet, she noticed something that made her heart skip, a clear paw print, larger than those they had been following, pressed deep into the white surface. But what caught her attention was not the print itself, it was the deliberate way it had been placed, pointing directly toward the settlement below, like an arrow drawn. In the snow, the wolf had not simply led them to shelter, it had marked the path for others to follow, creating a sign as clear as any words carved in stone. This was no chance encounter between desperate humans and a wild animal. This was something else entirely, something that spoke of intelligence and purpose beyond the natural world. "Follow me," the print seemed to say, and Tahoma knew she would. The descent into the valley tested every reserve of strength Tahoma had left. What had looked like a gentle slope from the ridge revealed itself as a treacherous path of loose stone and hidden ice patches that threatened to send them tumbling into the canyon below. Nalnish had grown so heavy across her shoulders that she could barely feel her legs, and behind her, Ayana's breathing had become labored gasps that sounded too loud in the thin mountain air. But the wolf never faltered. It picked its way down the slope with the sure-footed grace of a creature born to this harsh landscape, pausing at each switchback to ensure they were still following, sometimes circling back to nose at Ayana's hand when the girl stumbled and nearly fell. There was something profoundly reassuring about its constant presence, as if the animal had appointed itself their guardian and would not abandon them regardless of how slowly they moved or how many times they needed to rest. Halfway down the slope, Tahoma's strength finally gave out completely. Her legs buckled, and she found herself sitting hard in the snow, Nalnish sliding from her shoulders into her lap. The boy was barely conscious, his small face pale as winter sky and his breathing so shallow she had to press her ear to his chest to confirm he still lived. "I can't," she whispered to the wolf, which had immediately returned when it sensed their distress. "I can't carry him any farther." The animal regarded her with those ancient gold eyes, then did something extraordinary. It approached Nalnish and began licking the boy's face with long, gentle strokes of its rough tongue. The warmth and moisture seemed to revive him slightly. His eyelids fluttered open, and he made a soft sound that might have been a laugh. "The wolf is washing me," he said in Apache, his voice barely audible but holding a note of wonder that broke Tahoma's heart. "Like Mama used to do." Ayana crawled through the snow to her brother's side, her own exhaustion forgotten in concern for him. "We're almost there, little brother. Look, you can see the smoke from their fires. There will be warm food and soft beds and people who will help us get strong again." Tahoma pulled both children close, sharing what little body heat she had, left while she studied the settlement below. From this distance, she could make out more details, perhaps a dozen buildings arranged around what looked like a central courtyard, with corrals for animals and storage sheds that spoke of a permanent community rather than a temporary camp. The architectural style was mixed. Some structures clearly built in the Mexican fashion with their thick adobe walls and flat roofs, others showing the influence of American settlers with peaked roofs and stone foundations. Most puzzling was the variety of people she could see moving about their daily business. Even from this height, She could distinguish different styles of dress and movement, the flowing skirts and bright colors favored by Mexican women, the practical pants and boots of American frontier folk, and what looked like at least one figure in the buckskin and feathers of her own people. This was not a settlement of any single group, but rather some kind of mixing place where different cultures had come together for reasons she could not yet fathom. The wolf rose and padded a few steps down the slope, then looked back at them expectantly. Its message was clear. They had rested long enough. The settlement was close now, close enough that Tahoma could smell wood smoke and cooking food carried on the wind. But those last few 100 yards might as well have been miles if she could not find the strength to carry Nalnish. "Let me try," Ayana said, struggling to her feet and reaching for her younger brother. "I can help carry him." The sight of the 8-year-old girl attempting to lift her brother stirred something deep in Tahoma's chest, a grandmother's fierce protectiveness mixed with pride at the child's courage. But before she could object to this impossible plan, the wolf intervened again. It moved to Ayana's side and simply stood there, solid and steady as a boulder, until the girl understood and draped herself across its back. "It wants to carry me," Ayana said with delight, wrapping her small arms around the animal's thick neck. "It's offering to help." Tahoma stared at this unprecedented sight. Her granddaughter riding a wild wolf like some figure from the old stories her own grandmother had told around winter fires. But there was no denying that the animal seemed perfectly at ease with its burden, and when it began walking again, its gait was smooth and measured to avoid jostling the girl. This arrangement allowed Tahoma to carry Nalnish more easily, cradling him against her chest instead of across her shoulders. The boy seemed to revive slightly when held upright, his breathing becoming more regular and his color improving from deathly pale to merely exhausted. She began to speak to him in the old language, telling him stories of brave children who had faced great trials and emerged stronger, weaving in references to the wolf spirit that now carried his sister down the mountain. The path leveled out. As they approached the settlement, winding through what had once been cultivated fields, now buried under snow, Tahoma could see the careful planning that had gone into this place. Irrigation channels that would bring water to crops during the growing season. Terraced gardens that would make the most of the available soil. Storage buildings positioned to take advantage of prevailing winds for cooling in summer and shelter in winter. But what struck her most were the people who had begun to notice their approach. A woman in a bright blue rebozo emerged from one of the adobe houses and shaded her eyes to peer up the path. A man in the leather vest and wide-brimmed hat of a vaquero straightened from his work with a hammer and nails to study their small procession. Children playing in the snow stopped their games to stare at the extraordinary sight of other children arriving on foot and wolfback in the middle of winter. None of them seemed alarmed by the wolf's presence. If anything, they appeared relieved, as if the animal's return had answered some question or resolved some concern. Several people began moving toward them, not with the wariness she would have expected when strangers approached a settlement, but with the purposeful stride of those coming to offer assistance. "Diego will be pleased," she heard one woman say to another as they drew near. "He has been watching the trail every day since Luna left." Luna. Tahoma filed the name away as the first piece of solid information about their situation. The wolf had a name, which meant these people knew it well. More than that, someone called Diego had been expecting the animal's return, which suggested this was not a random rescue, but part of some larger pattern she did not yet understand. The wolf, Luna, padded directly to the largest of the adobe buildings, a structure that might have been a trading post or community gathering place. There it stopped and lowered itself to allow Ayana to slide from its back, then sat patiently while the girl found her footing in the snow. The animal's golden eyes fixed on Tahoma with what looked like satisfaction, as if to say, "I have kept my promise. Now it is up to others." Before Tahoma could fully process what was happening, she found herself surrounded by gentle hands and concerned voices speaking a mixture of Spanish, English, and Apache. Someone took Nalnish from her arms with practiced care. Someone else wrapped a warm blanket around Ayana's shoulders and began speaking to her in accented but understandable Apache about food and rest. But it was the man who emerged from the largest building who made Tahoma's world tilt on its axis. Tall and lean, with the weathered face of someone who spent his life outdoors, he moved with the careful grace of a man who had learned to be gentle despite his size. His dark hair was touched with premature grey, and his brown eyes held a weight of sorrow that spoke of loss endured and survived. When he saw her face, those eyes widened in recognition and what might have been hope. When he spoke, his voice carried the careful pronunciation of someone speaking his second language with deep respect. "Tahoma," he said in Apache, "I have been waiting for Luna to bring you home." The name hit Tahoma like a physical blow, driving the breath from her lungs and making her knees buckle. Strong hands caught her before she could fall, but she barely noticed them as she stared into the face of a man she had never expected to see again. Diego Morales stood before her, older and marked by grief but unmistakably the same person who had vanished from their lives like smoke on the wind, leaving only heartbreak and unanswered questions behind. "You," she whispered in Spanish, the word carrying 3 years of anger, confusion, and desperate hope. "You left them, you left us all." Diego's face crumpled with the weight of old shame, but he did not look away from her accusing gaze. Around them, the other settlers had formed a respectful circle, giving them space for this reunion while remaining close enough to help if needed. Ayana and Nalnish had been whisked away by gentle hands, the girl wide-eyed with growing recognition, the boy too exhausted to protest being separated from his grandmother. "I know," Diego said, his voice rough with emotion. "I know what it looked like, what it was. But please, let me explain. Let me try to make you understand why I had to leave, and why I have spent every day since then trying to find a way to bring you back." Tahoma felt Luna's warm body press against her legs, offering support that seemed both physical and spiritual. The wolf's presence steadied her, reminding her that nothing about this day had been random or accidental. If Luna had guided them, if the animal had known exactly where to find this settlement and this man, then there were larger forces at work than simple coincidence. "The children need care first," she said finally, surprised by how steady her own voice sounded. "Whatever explanations you owe can wait until they are warm and fed and sleeping safely." Diego nodded immediately, the relief in his eyes telling her this was exactly the response he had hoped for. "Of course, Elena." He turned to a middle-aged Mexican woman who had been hovering nearby with motherly concern. "Please see that they have everything they need. Hot food, clean clothes, the softest beds we have." "Already arranged," Elena replied, briskly, speaking Apache with an accent that suggested years of practice. "The boy especially needs attention. His breathing is not good and his color worries me. But we have had worse cases and nursed them back to health. These children are strong. They have their grandmother's spirit." As Elena and several other women led the children toward what appeared to be a communal kitchen, Ayana turned back to look at Tahoma with eyes that held questions far beyond her 8 years. "Grandmother, is this Papa Diego, the one from Mama's stories?" The simple question hung in the cold air like a challenge, demanding honesty in a situation where every truth seemed to carry the weight of old wounds and new possibilities. Tahoma looked at Diego and saw him waiting for her answer with the same intensity as the child. "Yes," she said finally, "this is your Papa Diego. He has some explaining to do, but yes, this is him." Ayana's face lit up with a smile that transformed her exhaustion into something resembling joy. "Mama said you would take care of us if something happened to her. She said you loved us even though you had to go away." Diego's composure finally cracked at those words. Tears ran down his weathered cheeks as he dropped to one knee to bring himself to Ayana's eye level. Your mama was wise beyond her years. Little star. She understood things that I was too afraid and too stupid to see. But yes, I love you both more than my own life, and I have never stopped trying to find a way to prove it. The girl studied his face with the grave attention of someone far older than her years, then reached out to touch the tears on his cheeks. Don't cry, Papa Diego. We're here now. Luna brought us home, just like you trained her to do. That revelation sent another shock through Tahoma's understanding of their situation. You trained her? Luna was doing this on your orders? Diego rose slowly, his hand briefly touching Ayana's hair, before the girl was led away by Elena's gentle insistence. Not orders? Luna makes her own choices about whom to help and how. But yes, I taught her to watch the high trails, to recognize people in distress, and to guide them here if she judged them worthy of sanctuary. She has brought us 12 families over the past 2 years. You are the first she has sought out. Specifically, how could she know to look for us? How could she know we existed? Instead of answering immediately, Diego gestured toward the largest building behind them. Will you come inside? There are things I need to show you, stories I need to tell, and you need warmth and food as much as the children do. Tahoma hesitated, part of her still wanting to rail at this man who had abandoned them in their darkest hour. But Luna pressed against her legs again, and she found herself trusting the wolf's judgment as she had learned to trust it on the mountain. If Luna approved of Diego, if the animal had brought them here deliberately, then there were depths to this situation she had not yet fathomed. The building's interior was warm and welcoming, with thick adobe walls that held the heat from a large central fireplace and windows that let in the grey afternoon light. But what caught Tahoma's attention immediately were the objects that decorated the walls and shelves, things that spoke of careful preservation and loving memory. Maria's silver necklace hung in a place of honor above the fireplace, polished to a bright gleam that caught the light. Beside it was a small painting of her daughter as a young woman, smiling in a way that captured perfectly the joy she had brought to every room she entered. On a nearby shelf sat the wooden cross that had blessed their wedding ceremony, flanked by candles that showed signs of frequent lighting. I never stopped loving her, Diego said quietly, following Tahoma's gaze to these treasures. Never stopped mourning her loss or regretting the way I failed her family in my grief. But I was drowning, Tahoma. Maria's death broke something in me that I didn't know how to repair. I thought if I stayed, I would only bring more pain to you and the children. Tahoma turned to study his face, looking for signs of the weakness and cowardice she had assumed motivated his departure. Instead, she saw something she recognized from her own mirror, the hollow exhaustion of someone who had lost everything that mattered and was struggling to find a reason to continue living. So you came here, she said, not yet ready to forgive, but beginning to understand. I came here because I was lost, and this place takes in the lost, but I stayed because I realized something important. Diego moved to warm his hands at the fire, his movements careful and deliberate. Maria didn't just love me despite being Mexican. She loved me because love doesn't recognize the boundaries we try to put around it. She saw something here, in this valley, in this community. She saw the future she wanted for her children. Future you denied them when you ran away. Yes. Diego's acceptance of the accusation was immediate and complete. I ran from responsibility, from pain, from everything that reminded me of what I had lost. But running taught me something else, that love doesn't die just because the beloved does. It changes, it transforms, but it endures, and it calls us home eventually, if we're brave enough to listen. Luna had settled beside the fireplace, her golden eyes reflecting the flames as she watched this reunion unfold. There was something almost smug in her expression, as if she had orchestrated events exactly as she had intended and was pleased with the results. You said she sought us out specifically, Tahoma said. How? Diego knelt beside the wolf and scratched, behind her ears, with the familiarity of long companionship. Luna has abilities that go beyond normal wolves. She reads scents on the wind, follows trails that are weeks old, seems to understand things about people that even they don't know about themselves. 3 months ago, she began acting restless, ranging farther and farther into the high country. When I realized she was searching for something or someone, I began watching for signs of what she might find. He reached into a wooden chest beside the fireplace and withdrew something that made Tahoma's breath catch. Her father's hunting knife lay in Diego's palms, the blade cleaned and oiled, the leather grip mended with careful stitches. "She brought me this 2 weeks ago," Diego said simply, dropped it at my feet, and then sat staring up the mountain like she was waiting for permission to continue her search. "That's when I knew she had found you, and that you were in danger." The knife felt familiar and strange in Tahoma's hands, like greeting an old friend after years of separation. She examined the careful repairs Diego had made, noting how he had preserved even the small chip where her father had once deflected. A mountain cat's claw. This was the reverent care of a man honoring a sacred object. "You kept it," she said. "Luna brought it to me because it belonged here, with family." Diego settled across from her, his movements careful. "But also because I hoped someday I would return it to its rightful owner." Through the thick walls, Tahoma could hear community. Life continuing, children's laughter, a blacksmith's hammer, women calling in mixed languages that formed harmonious sound. It was the music Maria had always dreamed of. "Tell me about this place," Tahoma said, securing the knife at her belt. "Tell me how a Mexican trader becomes part of a settlement that welcomes Apache grandmothers." Diego's smile held both sadness and pride. "I'm not the leader here. We have no single leader, but I suppose I'm the reason it exists." He gestured toward the windows. "When I left you and the children, I rode north without destination. I was like a wounded animal, looking for a place to die in peace. I found this valley by accident. My horse went lame, and I was forced to stop. While deciding whether to put him out of his misery, I discovered I was not alone." Diego pointed toward the eastern wall where a small shrine held Apache's sacred items: eagle feather, turquoise, sage bundle tied with sinew. Joseph Crow Feather was already here, living alone in a cave. He had been exiled for defending his daughters. Choice to marry a white soldier, his family had been killed in a cavalry raid, and he came here to die with dignity. The name stirred Tahoma's memory, stories of a war chief who tried negotiating peace, branded traitor by both sides. Joseph Crow Feather had been renowned for wisdom and seeing beyond immediate conflicts. He is still here. He died last spring, peacefully, surrounded by children he helped raise and families he helped heal. But his influence lives on. Diego's voice carried reverence. "Joseph taught me that exile doesn't mean isolation, that being cast out creates opportunity to build something better. The Apache way teaches that blood calls to blood, that the people cannot survive if divided." Joseph would have agreed, but he understood that sometimes the body grows sick, and healing requires creating new, healthy tissue that can grow back. Into the whole, this place, these people, we are that new growth. Elena entered carrying food, followed by a younger woman whose mixed heritage showed in her features, and an older white man with sun-weathered skin. "The children are resting," Elena announced. "Both ate well and are sleeping naturally. The boy's breathing has improved. They will be fine." Relief flooded Tahoma so intensely it left her dizzy. For the first time in months, she could believe Ayana and Nalnish would see another season. "Maria Luz runs our school and teaches children to read in 3 languages, Diego said, indicating the younger woman. "She also serves as healer, combining Elena's remedies with Apache plant knowledge." "Tom Wheeler," the older man added, extending a calloused hand. "Former cavalry sergeant, current blacksmith, living proof that a man can change his path if he admits his mistakes." Tahoma studied Tom's face for signs of casual cruelty she expected from soldiers. Instead, she saw something that reminded her of Diego, the hollow look of a man who had lost everything and was building something better from ruins. "You fought against the Apache," she said. "I did. At Apache Pass, Skeleton Canyon, a dozen smaller actions." Tom's acknowledgement carried neither pride nor shame, just unchangeable facts. "I followed orders, told myself I was protecting civilization, managed to sleep by convincing myself it was necessary." "What changed?" Tom glanced at Diego, who nodded encouragingly. "I was ordered to burn out a small band raiding supply wagons, standard operation, surround at dawn, kill warriors, capture women and children for relocation. But we found a family group trying to surrender for weeks. Old people, women with babies, teenage boys too young to be real threats. You followed orders anyway." "My men did. I tried to stop it, but shooting had started. In that chaos, you can't control what happens." Tom's voice remained steady, but Tahoma saw the cost in lines around his eyes. "I spent 3 days burying children who look like ones I have here now, and realized something obvious, which was that there are no savages in war. Only people doing terrible things because they're too afraid or proud or angry to remember their enemies have families who love them." Tom gestured toward Joseph's shrine. "Joseph helped me understand I could carry that guilt like poison, or build something honoring the memory of people I failed to protect." "And now you shoe horses for Apache grandmothers," she observed, and teach boys to work metal. Help grandfathers remember not all white men are enemies." Tom's smile carried genuine warmth. "It's not much, but it's better than before." As afternoon wore on, Tahoma found herself relaxing into conversation with these unlikely companions. Each had stories of transformation, of finding purpose in service to others rather than service to old hatreds. But it was Diego who revealed the deeper purpose behind their community. As Luna dozed at their feet, he spoke of Maria's vision, not just for her children, but for a different way of living that honored past while embracing change. "She understood something I was too young and stubborn to see," he said softly. "She knew the old ways of dividing people into us, and them were dying, whether we liked it or not. The question wasn't whether change would come, but whether we would help shape it or be swept away." Tahoma fingered the turquoise stone from her homeland, feeling its familiar weight. "And you think this place is the answer?" "I think this place is one attempt at an answer. Whether it's right will depend on whether people like you decide to help us find out." That night, Tahoma lay on a soft bed for the first time in months, listening to her grandchildren's steady breathing. Elena had insisted they share the same room, and Tahoma was grateful for the comfort. But sleep eluded her despite exhaustion. Too much had changed too quickly. Diego was alive and thriving. The children were safe and recovering. Luna had revealed abilities that bordered on miraculous, yet she wrestled with questions that had no easy answers. A soft knock interrupted her thoughts. "Grandmother Tahoma?" Maria Luz spoke in careful Apache. "There is something I think you should see." Tahoma followed the younger woman into the crisp night air. The settlement looked different in moonlight, more peaceful but also mysterious. "What am I looking at?" Tahoma asked as Maria Luz led her toward the eastern edge, where fields gave way to scrubland. "Wait," Maria Luz said, settling on a fallen log. "Watch the ridgeline and listen." For long minutes they sat in silence. Then she heard it, a low howl seeming to come from multiple directions, rising and falling in patterns too complex to be random. "Luna's pack," Maria Luz explained softly. "They sing to her every few days, but tonight is different. Tonight they're singing welcome songs, the kind wolf mothers use when lost cubs find their way home." As if summoned, Luna appeared at the settlement's edge, her silver-gray coat shimmering in moonlight. Behind her came two smaller shapes, younger wolves, their movements cautious but following Luna's lead. "Her offspring," Maria Luz whispered. "She's been teaching them to help guide lost travelers. This is the first time she's brought them to meet newcomers." Tahoma watched as the three wolves arranged themselves in a semicircle, close enough to study the humans but maintaining distance. The younger animals were nervous, but they trusted Luna's judgment. "Why are you showing me this?" "Because tomorrow the children will ask if this can truly be their home, and you need answers from your heart rather than your fears." Maria Luz spoke with quiet certainty. "Luna is showing you that even wild things can learn new ways without losing their essential nature." The truth struck Tahoma with unexpected force. She had been thinking in terms of choosing between her Apache identity and this new community. But what if it was possible to remain fully Apache while also becoming something more? "How did you come to be here?" Tahoma asked. "My Apache mother was cast out for loving a Mexican trader, just like Maria. But I grew up learning I could honor both parts of my heritage without betraying either." Maria Luz gestured toward the wolves. "Joseph Crow Feather taught me old stories. Elena taught me to cook with chilies. Tom Wheeler taught me to read English. Each gift made me more than I was before, not less." "And your children?" "Everything," Maria Luz said simply. "All the languages, stories, skills they need to build bridges instead of walls. They will understand that love is stronger than fears that try to keep people apart." Luna rose and padded closer, her golden eyes reflecting moonlight as she studied Tahoma's face. There was something different in the wolf's expression, not urgent need to guide, but patient curiosity about what choice the human would make. "She's asking what you've decided," Maria Luz observed. "Whether you'll stay and help us build this place or take the children and try to return to the world you left behind." Back in her room, both children were awake and waiting. Ayana sat up in bed, her dark eyes bright with questions. "Are we going to stay, grandmother?" Ayana asked. "Papa Diego says we can have our own room, and Maria Luz says she'll teach us to read books." The simple longing in the girl's voice broke Tahoma's heart and mended it simultaneously. "Would you like to stay?" Tahoma asked, settling on the edge of Ayana's bed. "I want to stay where Mama would be happy," Nalnish said in his small, serious voice. "I want to learn the old stories, but I also want to learn new things. I want to be Apache like she was, but I also want to help lost people find homes." Out of the mouths of children came wisdom that adults complicated with fears. Tahoma looked at these two small faces and realized her daughter had already answered the question that had been tormenting her. The choice wasn't between Apache and Mexican, between old ways and new ones. The choice was between love and fear, between building bridges and maintaining walls. "We'll stay," she said, and felt the turquoise stone warm against her palm, as if the spirits were giving their blessing. "We'll stay and help build something worthy of your mother's dreams." Outside, Luna howled once from the darkness, and Tahoma chose to hear it as a song of welcome home. That night, Tahoma lay on a soft bed in a warm room for the first time in months, listening to the steady breathing of her grandchildren in the beds beside her. Elena had insisted they all share the same space until the children felt secure in their new surroundings, and Tahoma was grateful for both the practical wisdom and the emotional comfort of having them close. But sleep eluded her despite her exhaustion. Too much had changed too quickly, and her mind struggled to process the implications of everything she had learned. Diego was alive and apparently thriving in this strange mixed community. The children were safe and already showing signs of recovery from their ordeal. Luna had revealed herself to be not just a wolf, but some kind of spiritual guide with abilities that bordered on the miraculous. All of this should have filled her with relief and gratitude. Instead, she found herself staring at the ceiling and wrestling with questions that had no easy answers. What did she owe to the tribal council that had exiled her? What did she owe to these new people who had welcomed her so readily? What did she owe to the memory of Maria, who had died believing in a future that looked very much like what Diego had built in this valley? The turquoise stone felt warm against her palm as she rolled it between her fingers, and she found herself remembering her grandmother's voice, speaking words that had seemed like simple stories when she was young, but now carried the weight of prophecy. There will come a time when the people must choose between the old paths and new ones, between the safety of what they know and the risk of what they might become. In that time, look for the signs of the spirits. They will show you which choice leads to life. A soft knock at the door interrupted her thoughts. Grandmother Tahoma, it was Maria Luz, speaking in careful Apache. Forgive me for disturbing your rest, but there is something I think you should see. Tahoma rose carefully, checking to make sure the children were still sleeping soundly, then followed the younger woman out into the crisp night air. The settlement looked different in the moonlight, more peaceful perhaps, but also more mysterious. Shadows moved between the buildings in ways that might have been people or animals or simply tricks of light and darkness. "What am I looking at?" Tahoma asked, as Maria Luz led her toward the eastern edge of the settlement, where the cultivated fields gave way to wild scrubland. "Wait," Maria Luz said simply, settling herself on a fallen log that had been positioned to serve as a bench. "Watch the ridgeline and listen." For long minutes they sat in comfortable silence, while Tahoma's eyes adjusted to the darkness and her ears learned to distinguish the natural sounds of night from anything that might be unusual. Then she heard it, a low howl that seemed to come from multiple directions at once, rising and falling in a pattern that was too complex to be random. "Luna's pack," Maria Luz explained softly. "They sing to her every few days, and she answers them. But tonight is different. Tonight they're singing welcome songs, the kind wolf mothers use when lost cubs find their way home, as if summoned." By her words, Luna appeared at the edge of the settlement, her silver-grey coat shimmering in the moonlight as she trotted toward them with the confident gait of an animal completely at ease in her territory. Behind her came two smaller shapes that resolved themselves into younger wolves, their movements more cautious, but clearly following Luna's lead. "Her offspring," Maria Luz whispered. "She's been teaching them to help guide lost travelers, just as she does. This is the first time she's brought them to meet newcomers." Tahoma watched in fascination as the three wolves arranged themselves in a semicircle, close enough to study the humans, but maintaining enough distance to flee if necessary. The two younger animals were clearly nervous about the proximity to people, but they trusted Luna's judgment enough to remain where she had positioned them. "Why are you showing me this?" Tahoma asked. "Because tomorrow the children will ask you questions about whether this can truly be their home, and you will need to give them answers that come from your heart rather than your fears." Maria Luz spoke with the quiet certainty of someone who had wrestled with similar questions and found her own peace. "Luna is showing you that even wild things can learn new ways without losing their essential nature. Her cubs are still wolves. They will always be wolves, but they are also something more than their ancestors were." The truth of that observation struck Tahoma with unexpected force. She had been thinking in terms of choosing between her Apache identity and this new community, between loyalty to the old ways and acceptance of change. But what if those weren't the only options? What if it was possible to remain fully Apache, while also becoming something more? "How did you come to be here?" Tahoma asked, recognizing in the younger woman's mixed features something similar to what she saw in her own grandchildren. "My Apache mother was cast out for loving a Mexican trader, just like Maria. But my story had a different ending. My parents found this valley when I was still a baby, and I grew up learning that I could honor both parts of my heritage without betraying either one." Maria Luz gestured toward the wolves, which had begun to relax into more natural postures. "Joseph Crow Feather taught me the old stories and the sacred songs. Elena taught me to cook with chilies and cumin. Tom Wheeler taught me to read English and to shoe a horse. Each gift made me more than I was before, not less. And your children, what will you teach them?" "Everything," Maria Luz said simply. "All the languages, all the stories, all the skills they will need to build bridges instead of walls. They will know they are Apache and Mexican and American all at once, and they will understand that love is stronger than the fears that try to keep people apart. Luna rose and padded closer, her golden eyes reflecting the moonlight as she studied Tahoma's face. There was something different in the wolf's expression tonight, not the urgent need to guide that had characterized their mountain journey, but a patient curiosity about what choice the human would make now that she had been brought to safety. "She's asking what you've decided," Maria Luz observed. "Whether you'll stay and help us build this place into something that could welcome your grandchildren's grandchildren, or whether you'll take the children and try to return to the world you left behind." The question hung in the night air like a challenge, and Tahoma found herself thinking not of the tribal council that had cast her out, but of the dreams Maria had shared during those brief, happy years in Las Cruces. Her daughter had often spoken of a place where her children could grow up without having to choose between parts of themselves, where love could cross any boundary that prejudice tried to erect. "If I stayed," Tahoma said carefully, "what would you expect of me? What role would there be for an Apache grandmother who has spent her life learning the old ways? The same role grandmothers have always had," Maria Luz replied with a smile that reminded Tahoma powerfully of Maria at the same age. "To teach the children who they are, to keep the important stories alive, and to help the younger generations understand that change and tradition can live together in the same heart." Luna made a soft sound that might have been approval, then turned and trotted back toward the wild country beyond the settlement. Her offspring followed, but not before the smallest of them looked back at Tahoma with what seemed like a wolf's version of a smile. "Think about it," Maria Luz said, as they made their way back toward the warm buildings. "But don't think too long. Winter is ending, and with spring will come travelers who need the kind of wisdom you carry. The mountain trails will be full of people looking for new homes, new chances, new ways to heal old wounds." Back in her room, Tahoma found both children awake and waiting for her return. Ayana sat up in bed, her dark eyes bright with questions, while Nalnish remained curled under his blankets, but clearly listening to every word. "Are we going to stay, grandmother?" Ayana asked. "Papa Diego says we can have our own room, and Maria Luz says she'll teach us to read books, and Tom Wheeler says he'll show me how to make horseshoes." The simple longing in the girl's voice broke Tahoma's heart and mended it at the same time. When had Ayana last spoken of the future with such hope? When had either child been able to plan beyond the next meal, the next shelter, the next day of survival? "Would you like to stay?" Tahoma asked, settling onto the edge of Ayana's bed and reaching out to smooth Nalnish's hair. "I want to stay where Mama would be happy," Nalnish said in his small, serious voice. "I want to learn the old stories, like she used to tell us, but I also want to learn new things. I want to be Apache like she was, but I also want to be like Papa Diego and help lost people find homes." Out of the mouths of children came the wisdom that adults made complicated with their fears and pride. Tahoma looked at these two small faces, Maria's eyes in Ayana's features, Maria's gentle spirit in Nalnish's desire to help others, and realized that her daughter had already answered the question that had been tormenting her. The choice wasn't between Apache and Mexican, between old ways and new ones, between loyalty and change. The choice was between love and fear, between building bridges and maintaining walls, between honoring the past by creating a better future or betraying it by refusing to grow. "We'll stay," she said, and felt the turquoise stone warm against her palm, as if the spirits of her ancestors were giving their blessing to this decision. "We'll stay and help build something worthy of your mother's dreams." Outside, Luna howled, once from the darkness beyond the settlement, and Tahoma chose to hear it as a song of welcome home. Spring came early to the valley, bringing warm rains that promised abundant crops and full streams. Tahoma had settled into community life with surprising ease, finding herself valued not just as keeper of Apache traditions, but as a practical woman whose knowledge proved invaluable to their settlement. The children had thrived beyond her most optimistic hopes. Nalnish had grown strong and confident, his laughter now a daily sound that filled spaces where fear and hunger had once lived. Ayana had revealed a quick mind and gentle hands that made her equally suited to learning Maria Luz's healing arts and helping Tom Wheeler in his forge. Both children moved easily between the languages and customs of their mixed heritage, embodying the vision of unity that had drawn their parents together. But it was Diego's transformation that surprised Tahoma most. The broken, grieving man who had fled from responsibility had evolved into someone she barely recognized, a natural leader whose quiet strength and genuine compassion had made him the unofficial heart of their unusual community. On a warm morning, in early April, as Tahoma was teaching children to identify edible plants in the meadow beyond the settlement, Luna appeared with unusual urgency in her posture. The wolf paced back and forth, looking toward the mountain trails, and then back at Tahoma with clear expectation. "Someone's coming," Ayana said, reading the animal's behavior with intuition she had developed over their months together. Luna always acts like this when travelers are approaching, but this felt different from the wolf's previous alerts. There was tension in Luna's movements that spoke of potential significance rather than simple need, and the wolf's hackles were slightly raised in a display Tahoma had not seen since their first encounter. The delegation that emerged from the pine trees was larger than any group of travelers they had yet received. 8 riders moved in the disciplined formation of people accustomed to potential conflict, their weapons visible but not immediately threatening. At their head rode a man Tahoma recognized, despite the years that had aged his features, Chief Running Hawk, her own cousin and current leader of their band. Beside him rode 2 other figures that made Tahoma's breath catch. The first was Elena, White Moon, the woman who had replaced Tahoma as keeper of the women's traditions and teacher of sacred songs. The second was her own nephew, Carlos Firewalker, Maria's younger brother, who had been barely 16 when the family was exiled. "They've come for us," Tahoma said quietly, her hand instinctively moving to rest on her father's knife. "The tribal council has sent them to bring us back." Diego moved to stand beside her, offering both support and protection. "Not necessarily. They might simply be curious about reports they've heard of this place." But Tahoma knew her people too. Well, to believe in innocent curiosity, a delegation of this size meant official business of the most serious kind. Either they had come to demand the return of exiled members, or they had come to address some threat this settlement was perceived to represent. Running Hawk's party approached slowly, making deliberate movements that announced peaceful intentions, while maintaining readiness for other possibilities. When close enough for conversation, the chief raised his hand in traditional greeting, his weathered face revealing nothing of his thoughts. "Tahoma, daughter of my father's brother," he said, in Apache, his voice carrying formal tones reserved for official pronouncements. "We have traveled far to speak with you." "You are welcome here, Running Hawk," Tahoma replied, matching his formality while keeping her own options open. "Any of our people are always welcome in this place." "Are they our people?" Elena White. Moon spoke for the first time, her voice carrying an edge that suggested this was not a friendly family visit. "Reports have reached us of Apache children learning Mexican ways, of sacred songs being shared with outsiders, of traditional teachings being corrupted by foreign influences." The accusation hung in the morning air like smoke from a signal fire, demanding response and carrying implications that could shatter the fragile peace they had built. Tahoma felt the eyes of her new community upon her, waiting to see how she would navigate this challenge. "The children learn all the ways that will serve them in the world they must live in," Tahoma said carefully. "They know the old songs and stories as well as any children of the band. But they also know other skills, other languages, other ways of understanding their place in creation. And who gave you the right to make such decisions?" Carlos Firewalker's voice cracked with emotion as he urged his horse closer. "These are Maria's children, my sister's blood. They belong with their own people, not in this place of mixing and confusion. Before Tahoma could respond, a small voice cut through the tension. Uncle Carlos. Ayana had slipped away from the adults and now stood at the edge of the group, staring up at the young man who had been her mother's favorite sibling. Is that really you? The sight of his niece, alive, healthy, and obviously well cared for, broke Carlos's composure completely. He slid from his horse and dropped to one knee, tears streaming down his face as Ayana ran to embrace him. Behind them, Nalnish emerged from his hiding place and approached more cautiously, his memories dimmer, but his need for family connection equally strong. "My sister's babies," Carlos whispered, gathering both children into his arms. "When we heard you had died in the mountains, we mourned you as lost forever. How is it possible that you are here, safe and strong?" "Luna brought us here," Nalnish said simply. "The wolf that guides lost people home. She carried us through the snow when grandmother couldn't walk anymore, and she brought us to Papa Diego." At Diego's name, Carlos looked up sharply, his grief transforming into something that might have been anger or confusion. Diego Morales, but he abandoned you, left you to starve after my sister died." "No," Ayana said with fierce certainty of a child defending someone she loved. "Papa Diego was lost, just like we were lost. But Luna helped him find his way too, and now he takes care of all the lost people who come here. He takes care of us, the way Mama said he would." The simple truth of the child's words seemed to affect the entire Apache delegation. Running Hawk studied Diego with new interest, while Elena White Moon watched the interaction between the children and their stepfather. With obvious surprise, this was not the story they had expected to find. That evening, as the sun set behind the western mountains, the entire community gathered around a central fire, where Tahoma prepared to share the story of their arrival and rescue. She spoke in Apache, telling the traditional tale of how wolf spirits guide lost travelers to safety, but she included details that had never been part of the old stories. Mexican traders who became family, white soldiers who learned to build instead of destroy, and children who could move between worlds without losing their center. When she finished, Carlos stepped forward, carrying something that made Tahoma's heart skip. Maria's silver cross, the one that had blessed her wedding ceremony, gleamed in the firelight as he held it out to Diego. "My sister asked me to keep this safe until her children were old enough to understand its meaning," Carlos said. "I think the time has come. I think she would want them to know that love blessed by God and witnessed by family is stronger than any tribal law or traditional boundary." As Diego accepted the cross with shaking hands, Running Hawk rose to address the assembled community. "The tribal council sent us to bring back children who were being corrupted by foreign influences," he said in English so everyone could understand. "Instead, we have found Apache children who are being raised with honor, wisdom, and love by people who understand that the future requires new kinds of strength." He looked directly at Tahoma. "The council will not require your return, but they would welcome it if you choose to visit and share what you have learned about building bridges between peoples." That night, as the Apache delegation prepared to make camp near the settlement, Tahoma sat with Diego and the children around their own small fire. The silver cross lay on the blanket between them, catching the light and casting small reflections that danced like spirits in the darkness. "So we really can stay?" Ayana asked. "No one will try to make us choose between being Apache and being part of this family." "You will never have to choose," Tahoma promised, reaching out to touch the cross that had blessed her daughter's marriage and would now bless her grandchildren's future. "You are Apache, and you are part of this community, and you are loved by people who see no contradiction in those truths." Luna appeared at the edge of their firelight, her golden eyes reflecting the flames as she settled down to keep watch over this family she had worked so hard to bring together. In her patient presence, Tahoma saw confirmation. This was where they belonged. This was the home Maria had envisioned. And this was the future worth building for the children who would carry both traditions forward into whatever changes lay ahead. The acceptance by the Apache delegation should have brought perfect peace to the valley, but Tahoma found herself more restless than ever in the days that followed. Something stirred in her heart that had nothing to do with external conflicts and everything to do with unfinished business between her soul and the choices she had made over the years. Running Hawk's party had remained for a week, learning about the settlement's approach to blending traditions and observing how the children moved seamlessly between their Apache heritage and broader community identity. But their visit had stirred memories and possibilities that Tahoma struggled to process. "You're thinking of going back," Diego observed one evening as they watched the children play a game combining Apache storytelling with Mexican riddles and rules Tom Wheeler had learned from cavalry card games. "Not permanently, but to visit, to see if there's a way to heal the rift that's kept you apart from your people." Tahoma fingered the sacred turquoise stone that had become her constant companion, feeling its familiar weight as she considered how to put her complicated feelings into words. Running Hawk's invitation was genuine. The tribal council would welcome my return, at least temporarily. They want to understand what we've built here, but that's not what's troubling you, Diego pressed gently. Something deeper is calling you back to them. Before Tahoma could answer, Luna appeared at the edge of their gathering, her golden eyes fixed on something beyond the settlement's boundaries. The wolf's posture spoke of alertness rather than alarm, but there was an intensity that made both adults take notice. "She senses something," Tahoma murmured, rising to follow Luna's gaze toward the eastern mountains, where the Apache lands lay hidden beyond the horizon. "Not danger, but significance. Change coming." Maria Luz approached from the direction of the school building, carrying news that explained Luna's behavior. "Riders coming down the mountain trail," she reported, "but not from the direction we usually see travelers. These are coming from the southeast, moving fast like they carry urgent news." The 3 riders who entered the settlement an hour later bore the dust and exhaustion of men who had been traveling hard for several days. Their leader was a young Apache warrior Tahoma recognized as Swift Eagle, one of Running Hawk's most trusted scouts. His companions were Mexican vaqueros, whose presence alongside an Apache messenger spoke of cooperation that would have been unthinkable just a few years ago. "Grandmother Tahoma," Swift Eagle said in Apache, sliding from his horse with careful movements. "Chief Running Hawk sends word of great urgency. The agent at the reservation has been replaced by a man who does not honor the previous agreements. He speaks of moving our people to lands even farther from our sacred places, and he has threatened to use force against any who resist." The news struck the settlement like a physical blow. Everyone understood the implications, not just for the Apache bands, but for all the native peoples who had managed to maintain some autonomy. "What does Running Hawk want from us?" Diego asked, switching to Spanish so the vaqueros could follow the conversation. "He asks if the grandmother would return and speak to our council about the ways of cooperation she has learned here," Swift Eagle replied. "He believes that if we can show the new agent that we work in partnership with Mexican and American settlers, rather than as enemies, we might convince him that forced relocation is unnecessary." One of the vaqueros stepped forward, hat in hand with respectful manner. "Señora Tahoma, I am Miguel Herrera from the ranch near Las Cruces. The new agent has also threatened the Mexican families who trade with the Apache bands, saying we encourage resistance to American authority. But if we could show him a place where all peoples live in peace and prosperity, he might reconsider his harsh policies." Tahoma finished, understanding beginning to dawn. "You want our settlement to serve as an example of what's possible when different peoples choose cooperation over conflict." "More than that," Swift Eagle said earnestly. "Chief Running Hawk believes that you, specifically, could speak to the agent in ways that our male leaders cannot. You have lived in both worlds, raised children who embody the harmony we seek. Your voice carries the authority of a grandmother, but also the wisdom of someone who has built bridges instead of walls. Tahoma felt the weight of this request settle on her shoulders like a winter cloak, heavy, necessary, but also confining. These people were asking her to step forward as a spokesperson for everything their small community had achieved, to risk the safety and peace they had built by exposing it to scrutiny of officials who might not understand their unconventional approach. "When would this meeting take place?" she asked. "The agent has called for a great council in 1 month's time at Fort Stanton," Swift Eagle replied. "All the tribal leaders, the major Mexican ranchers, and the territorial officials will gather to hear his plans for the region. If you were to speak, the acceptance by the Apache delegation should have brought perfect peace to the valley, but Tahoma found herself more restless than ever in the days that followed. Something stirred in her heart that had nothing to do with external conflicts and everything to do with the unfinished business between her soul and the choices she had made over the years. Running Hawk's party had remained for a week, learning about the settlement's approach to blending traditions and observing how the children moved seamlessly between their Apache heritage and broader community identity. But their visit had stirred memories and possibilities that Tahoma struggled to process. "You're thinking of going back," Diego observed one evening as they watched the children play a game combining Apache storytelling with Mexican riddles and rules Tom Wheeler had learned from cavalry card games. "Not permanently, but to visit, to see if there's a way to heal the rift that's kept you apart from your people." Tahoma fingered the sacred turquoise stone that had become her constant companion, feeling its familiar weight as she considered how to put her complicated feelings into words. Running Hawk's invitation was genuine. The tribal council would welcome my return, at least temporarily. They want to understand what we've built here, and they're curious about whether our approach could help them navigate there. The revelation of Diego's true character and the acceptance by the Apache delegation should have brought perfect peace to the valley. But Tahoma found herself more restless than ever in the days that followed. Something stirred in her heart that had nothing to do with external conflicts and everything to do with the unfinished business between her own soul and the choices she had made over the years. Running Hawk and his party had remained for a week, learning about the settlement's unique approach to blending traditions and observing how the children moved seamlessly between their Apache heritage and their broader community identity. But their visit had stirred up memories and possibilities that Tahoma struggled to process in the quiet moments between her daily responsibilities. "You're thinking of going back," Diego observed one evening as they sat watching the children play a game that combined Apache storytelling with Mexican riddles and rules Tom Wheeler had learned from cavalry card games. "Not permanently, but to visit, to see if there's a way to heal the rift that's kept you apart from your people." Tahoma fingered the sacred turquoise stone that had become her constant companion, feeling its familiar weight as she considered how to put her complicated feelings into words. Running Hawk's invitation was genuine. The tribal council would welcome my return, at least temporarily. They want to understand what we've built here, and they're curious about whether our approach to bridging cultures could help them navigate their own challenges with the changing world. "But that's not what's troubling you," Diego pressed gently. "Something deeper is calling you back to them." Before Tahoma could answer, Luna appeared at the edge of their gathering, her golden eyes fixed on something beyond the settlement's boundaries. The wolf's posture spoke of alertness rather than alarm, but there was an intensity in her attention that made both adults take notice. "She senses something," Tahoma murmured, rising to follow Luna's gaze toward the eastern mountains where the Apache lands lay hidden beyond the horizon. Not danger, but significance, change coming. Maria Luz approached from the direction of the school building, carrying news that explained Luna's behavior. "Riders coming down the mountain trail," she reported, "but not from the direction we usually see travelers. These are coming from the Southeast, moving fast like they carry urgent news. The 3 riders who entered the settlement an hour later bore the dust and exhaustion of men who had been traveling hard for several days. Their leader was a young Apache warrior Tahoma recognized as Swift Eagle, one of Running Hawk's most trusted scouts. His companions were Mexican vaqueros, whose presence alongside an Apache messenger spoke of the kind of cooperation that would have been unthinkable just a few years ago. "Grandmother Tahoma," Swift Eagle said in Apache, sliding from his horse, with the careful movements of someone whose body protested every motion. Chief Running Hawk sends word of great urgency. The agent at the reservation has been replaced by a man who does not honor the previous agreements. He speaks of moving our people to lands even farther from our sacred places, and he has threatened to use force against any who resist. The news struck the settlement like a physical blow. Everyone understood the implications, not just for the Apache bands, but for all the native peoples who had managed to maintain some autonomy in the face of relentless pressure from the expanding American territory. "What does Running Hawk want from us?" Diego asked, switching to Spanish so the vaqueros could follow the conversation. "He asks if the grandmother would return and speak to our council about the ways of cooperation she has learned here." Swift Eagle replied in the same language. He believes that if we can show the new agent that we work in partnership with Mexican and American settlers rather than as enemies, we might convince him that forced relocation is unnecessary. One of the vaqueros stepped forward, hat in hand, with the respectful manner of a man addressing his elders. "Señora Tahoma, I am Miguel Herrera from the ranch near Las Cruces. The new agent has also threatened the Mexican families who trade with the Apache bands, saying we encourage resistance to American authority. But if we could show him a place where all peoples live in peace and prosperity, he might reconsider his harsh policies." Tahoma finished, understanding beginning to dawn. "You want our settlement to serve as an example of what's possible when different peoples choose cooperation over conflict. More than that," Swift Eagle said earnestly, "Chief Running Hawk believes that you, specifically, could speak to the agent in ways that our male leaders cannot. You have lived in both worlds, raised children who embody the harmony we seek. Your voice carries the authority of a grandmother, but also the wisdom of someone who has built bridges instead of walls." Tahoma felt the weight of this request settle on her shoulders like a winter cloak, heavy, necessary, but also confining. These people were asking her to step forward as a spokesperson for everything their small community had achieved, to risk the safety and peace they had built by exposing it to the scrutiny of officials who might not understand or approve of their unconventional approach. "When would this meeting take place?" she asked. "The agent has called for a great council in 1 month's time at Fort Stanton," Swift Eagle replied. "All the tribal leaders, the major Mexican ranchers, and the territorial officials will gather to hear his plans for the region. If you were to speak there, with the children as living proof of what harmony can achieve, no." The word came out more sharply than Tahoma had intended, but the thought of exposing Ayana and Nalnish to the political machinations and potential dangers of such a gathering filled her with protective fury. The children have suffered enough upheaval in their young lives. They will not be used as symbols or examples, no matter how worthy the cause. Diego reached out to touch her shoulder, offering silent support for her fierce protection of the little ones. But his eyes held a question that she knew she would have to answer soon. Would she go alone, leaving the children in the safety of the settlement while she faced whatever challenges awaited at Fort Stanton? Elena appeared with food and water for the exhausted messengers, and as they refreshed themselves, the entire community gradually gathered to hear the full extent of the crisis facing their native neighbors. Tom Wheeler's face grew grim as he recognized the pattern from his military days. New administrators eager to make their mark by solving the Indian problem through increasingly harsh measures. Elena crossed herself and murmured prayers in Spanish for the families that would be torn apart if forced relocations resumed. Maria Luz held her own young children closer as she contemplated the fragility of the peace they had all worked so hard to build. But it was Carlos Firewalker's appearance that surprised everyone most. Maria's younger brother had remained in the valley after Running Hawk's departure, claiming he needed time to fully understand what his sister's children were learning in their unusual environment. Now, as he listened to Swift Eagle's report, his face took on the determined expression Tahoma remembered from his childhood when he faced difficult challenges. "I will go with you, Aunt," he said in Apache, then repeated the commitment in Spanish and English so everyone could understand. "These are my sister's children too, and my blood. If you speak for this community at Fort Stanton, you should not face that council alone, and neither should you face it without proof of what you've accomplished here," Tom Wheeler added, his military bearing becoming more pronounced as he shifted into strategic thinking mode. "If the goal is to show that cooperation works better than conflict, then we need to demonstrate that former enemies can become allies. I'll go with you." A retired cavalry sergeant vouching for Apache wisdom might carry weight with officials who understand only military authority. The offer of support from these unlikely allies stirred something deep in Tahoma's chest. Not the desperate gratitude of someone who had no other options, but the quiet confidence that comes from knowing you do not stand alone. These people were volunteering to risk their own safety and peace to defend principles that had become more important to them than personal comfort. "If we do this," she said slowly, looking around at the faces that had become so dear to her over the months of shared challenges and small victories, we risk everything we've built here. Officials who disapprove of our mixing of cultures could use their authority to scatter our community, relocate the native families, restrict the movements of everyone else. "And if we don't do this," Diego replied with quiet firmness, "we risk watching other families face the same exile and persecution that brought most of us here in the first place. We risk letting fear decide our choices instead of love." Luna rose from her position near the fire and padded to Tahoma's side, pressing her warm flank against the woman's legs in a gesture of support and encouragement. The wolf's golden eyes held the same patient wisdom that had guided them through the mountain blizzard, but now it was focused on a different kind of storm, the political and cultural tempest that threatened to destroy everything they valued. "1 month," Tahoma said finally, her decision crystallizing as she spoke. "We have 1 month to prepare our case, to gather our evidence, to ready ourselves for whatever reception awaits us at Fort Stanton." She looked up at the stars, beginning to appear in the darkening sky, remembering her grandmother's teaching that the spirits often spoke through the arrangement of celestial lights. Tonight, the constellation her people called the Great Bear seemed to point directly toward the eastern mountains, toward the Apache lands, toward the place where her greatest test awaited. "We'll need to be more than examples," she continued, her voice growing stronger with each word. "We'll need to be advocates, teachers, bridges between worlds that have forgotten how to trust each other. And we'll need to remember that sometimes the greatest courage is not in fighting, but in showing a better way to live." Around the fire, heads nodded in agreement as the community began to understand the magnitude of what they were being asked to attempt. This was no longer just about preserving their small haven of peace and cooperation. This was about proving that such places could exist, could thrive, and could offer hope to a region torn by generations of conflict and mistrust. As the evening wound down and people began to drift back to their homes, Tahoma remained by the dying fire with Luna at her side. The wolf seemed to sense that another journey lay ahead, not the desperate flight from death they had shared in the winter, but a deliberate march toward a confrontation that could determine the fate of everyone they had come to love. "What do you think, old friend?" she whispered to Luna, scratching behind the wolf's ears. Are we strong enough to carry the hopes of so many people? Are we wise enough to find words that can change hearts as well as minds? Luna's answering look held the same message it had carried that first night in the frozen cave. Follow me. Trust in the path that opens before you. Have faith that love is stronger than the forces that try to divide us. Tomorrow, the real work would begin. The journey to Fort Stanton took 3 days through country holding both beauty and bitter memories. Tahoma rode with Carlos, Tom Wheeler, Miguel Herrera, and 2 other Mexican ranchers who had volunteered to testify about peaceful cooperation. With Apache bands, Luna had accompanied them partway, then disappeared into the high country with mysterious purpose. Diego remained behind to protect the settlement and care for the children. Ayana and Nalnish needed security, while their grandmother faced whatever challenges awaited. As they crested the final ridge, Tahoma's breath caught. What had been described as a simple council meeting looked like a military gathering, with cavalry tents surrounding buildings and armed soldiers stationed at regular intervals. The message was clear. This new Indian agent intended overwhelming strength. "They're expecting trouble," Tom Wheeler observed. "That many troops means they're planning to enforce whatever decisions get made here." Carlos studied the Apache encampment on the fort's eastern side, noting how traditional teepees were arranged to allow quick escape routes if negotiations turned hostile. "My people are ready for the worst, but still hoping for the best, Colonel." Harrison greeted them with courteous efficiency, explaining that Agent Samuel Curtis had arrived from Washington with orders to resolve ongoing instabilities through firm enforcement and strategic relocations. "Agent Curtis is a man of strong convictions," Harrison said carefully. "He believes welfare of all parties requires clear boundaries and unambiguous authority." Tahoma translated, Curtis intended to use force to impose his vision on a region slowly learning to manage its own relationships. Success depended on convincing him cooperation worked better than coercion. The Great Council convened in the fort's largest building, with officials, officers, tribal leaders, and representatives arranged in careful hierarchy. Agent Curtis sat at the head, flanked by guards, his stern demeanor and expensive clothing marking him as an outsider. Running Hawk spoke first, his words translated by an uncomfortable army interpreter. The Apache leader outlined his people's willingness to live peacefully, but made clear their determination to resist forced relocation. Mexican ranchers spoke next, emphasizing economic benefits of Apache trade relationships and warning relocations would destabilize the regional economy. Agent Curtis dismissed them as self-interested protests. Then Tom Wheeler stood, and the room's atmosphere shifted as a decorated former cavalry sergeant addressed the assembly. "Gentlemen, I've spent 20 years fighting Indians from Canada to the Rio Grande. I've seen what happens when military force becomes our only tool, and it creates more difficulties than it resolves. But I've also seen what happens when enemies choose to become neighbors. I've lived in a community where Apache grandmothers teach Mexican children medicinal plants, where former soldiers learn traditional hunting, where mixed families raise children who see cooperation as natural." Agent Curtis leaned forward, interest, engaged. "Where is this miraculous community, Sergeant? Less than 3 days' ride from here. I've brought witnesses who can testify to its success." Tom gestured toward Tahoma, who rose slowly, feeling every eye settle upon her. "This is Grandmother Tahoma, who has raised mixed Apache and Mexican children to be productive citizens, honoring both identities. She has knowledge for solutions based on wisdom rather than warfare." The moment had come. Tahoma stepped forward, drawing strength from the turquoise stone, and knowing Luna's spirit watched. She had survived exile, starvation, and loss of everything she'd thought defined her. "Agent Curtis," she began in English, voice steady, "I come not as a supplicant asking mercy, but as a grandmother who learned our children's future depends on building bridges instead of walls." Agent Curtis studied Tahoma with the calculating, gaze of a man accustomed to evaluating threats and opportunities. His clean-shaven face revealed nothing of his thoughts, but she could see him measuring her words against whatever preconceptions he had brought from Washington about the nature of Indian-white relations in the territories. "Grandmother Tahoma," he said finally, his tone carrying the patronizing courtesy officials often used when addressing native women. "I appreciate your willingness to share your perspective, but I'm sure you understand that policy must be based on broader considerations than individual experiences, however touching they might be." The dismissal stung, but Tahoma had expected it. She had not survived 48 years of life, 3 years of exile, and a winter that nearly killed her grandchildren by allowing herself to be intimidated by men who mistook authority for wisdom. "Agent Curtis," she replied, her voice taking on the steel her daughter had inherited and passed on to her own children. "I understand that you see me as one old Apache woman whose opinions carry little weight in the great affairs of territories and nations, but I also understand something that your reports from Washington cannot teach you." She stepped closer to the front of the room, close enough that every person present could see her face and hear the conviction in her voice. "I understand what happens to communities when fear becomes the guiding principle of policy. I understand what happens to children when they are forced to choose between parts of themselves. And I understand what happens when people in power assume that force is the only language their subjects can comprehend." Carlos rose to stand beside his aunt, his presence offering silent support and reminding everyone present that she spoke not just for herself but for family, for community, for the future they were all trying to build. One by one, the Mexican ranchers also stood, their solidarity creating a visual representation of the cooperation she was advocating. 3 years ago, Tahoma continued, my tribal council cast me out because I refused to let them take my grandchildren from their mother's arms. They were afraid that mixed-blood children would weaken our people, that love across tribal boundaries would lead to the destruction of our traditions. They chose the safety of separation over the risk of connection. Agent Curtis shifted in his chair, perhaps beginning to sense that this was not the simple plea for leniency he had expected. Around the room, other officials leaned forward with genuine interest as Tahoma's story unfolded. What they created instead was a family in exile, children without the support of extended community, an old woman forced to choose between pride and survival when winter came early and harsh. We nearly died because fear had made my people forget that love is stronger than the boundaries we draw on maps or in our hearts. She reached into her pouch and withdrew the eagle feather that had been her grandmother's, holding it so the light caught its iridescent surface. But the spirits who guide all people, Apache, Mexican, American, did not abandon us. They sent a wolf to show us that even wild things can learn new ways of living without losing their essential nature. Tom Wheeler stepped forward at the perfect moment, adding his voice to support her testimony. Sir, I've seen that wolf. I've watched it guide lost travelers to safety, bringing together people who might otherwise have remained enemies. The animal doesn't care about politics or racial boundaries. It cares about survival, about community, about protecting the vulnerable. You're asking me to base territorial policy on the behavior of a wolf? Agent Curtis's skepticism was evident, but Tahoma could hear underneath it a curiosity that hadn't been there at the beginning of the session. I'm asking you to base it on the results that Wolf has helped create, she replied. A community where Apache children learn traditional skills, alongside Mexican cooking and American reading. Where former cavalry soldiers work beside native hunters to feed families that include every heritage represented in this room. Where people who were taught to see each other as enemies have become family. She gestured toward Miguel Herrera, who nodded encouragingly. These Mexican ranchers will tell you that Apache families make reliable trading partners and valuable neighbors when they're not forced to choose between cooperation and cultural extinction. Tom Wheeler will tell you that former enemies make the strongest allies when they choose trust over fear. Running Hawk spoke up from his position among the tribal representatives, his words carrying the authority of a leader who had seen both war and peace. Agent Curtis, this woman speaks truth that your government needs to hear. The Apache bands are not disappearing, no matter how many times you move us to new reservations. We are adapting, learning, finding ways to honor our ancestors while preparing our children for the world they must inherit. The room fell silent as Agent Curtis considered what he had heard. When he finally spoke, his voice carried less certainty than it had at the session's beginning. Even if I accepted your arguments about local cooperation, which I'm not saying I do, I still have orders from Washington to establish clear boundaries and eliminate ongoing sources of conflict. Then let us show you a different kind of boundary, Tahoma said, pulling out the woven blanket that represented her community's approach to unity. The fabric incorporated Apache geometric patterns, Mexican colors, and stitching techniques Tom Wheeler had learned from his grandmother in Missouri. Not walls that separate, but bridges that connect while still honoring what makes each tradition valuable. She spread the blanket on the table in front of Agent Curtis, its beauty and complexity creating a moment of surprised silence in the room. This is what happens when people choose cooperation over conflict, when they decide that strength comes from inclusion rather than exclusion. Carlos added his voice to the testimony, speaking with the passion of someone who had seen transformation happen in his own family. My sister's children know they are fully Apache and fully part of the larger community that surrounds them. They don't have to choose between honoring their heritage and participating in the changing world. Agent Curtis studied the blanket for a long moment, then looked up at Tahoma with what might have been the beginning of respect. And you believe this approach could work on a larger scale, beyond your small settlement? I believe it's the only approach that will create lasting peace, Tahoma replied. Force may create temporary compliance, but it will never create the trust that makes neighbors into families. The session continued for several more hours, but Tahoma could feel the room's energy shifting as officials began to consider possibilities they hadn't imagined when the day began. She had planted seeds of doubt about the wisdom of purely punitive policies, and more importantly, she had offered a vision of what success might look like if they chose a different path. As the formal proceedings concluded, Agent Curtis approached her with the measured steps of a man reconsidering his assumptions. Grandmother Tahoma, I would like to visit this community you've described. I need to see for myself whether these bridges you speak of can bear the weight of real-world pressures. Tahoma felt Luna's spirit beside her, offering the same patient guidance that had carried them through the mountain blizzard to safety. You are welcome in our valley, Agent Curtis. Come and see what happens when people choose love over fear. 1 year later, Tahoma sat in the same spot where she had once watched Luna emerge from a winter storm. But now she was surrounded by sounds that would have seemed impossible during those desperate days in the frozen cave. Children's laughter echoed from the school building where Maria Luce taught lessons in 3 languages, while the ring of Tom Wheeler's hammer spoke of horseshoes being fitted and tools being mended for families who had made this valley their permanent home. The settlement had grown beyond their most optimistic dreams. Agent Curtis's visit had resulted in official recognition of their community as a model for territorial cooperation, bringing not just legitimacy, but also resources and protection. More importantly, it had attracted other families seeking the same kind of healing and hope that had drawn the original settlers to this place. Ayana, now 9 and tall for her age, approached carrying a letter that had arrived with the morning mail. At 14, she had become Tahoma's unofficial secretary and translator, equally comfortable writing in Apache syllabary, Spanish script, or English cursive, depending on the correspondent's needs. It's from Uncle Carlos, Ayana announced, settling beside her grandmother to read the news from the Apache reservation, where her uncle now served as a cultural liaison between the tribal council and territorial officials. He says the new policies are working well, and that 3 more mixed communities have been established using our model. Tahoma accepted the letter with hands that showed the arthritis of her 50 years, but still moved with the sure grace of someone who had never stopped working with them. Carlos's careful script told of Apache children attending school alongside Mexican and American classmates, of former enemies becoming business partners, of healing ceremonies that had been expanded to welcome participants from all backgrounds who approached them with proper respect. And the best news, Ayana continued, translating freely as her grandmother read, is that Running Hawk has been invited to Washington to advise the Bureau of Indian Affairs on implementing similar programs in other territories. The transformation still amazed Tahoma sometimes. The same tribal council that had once exiled her for defending her daughter's choices now sought her advice on matters affecting the entire Apache nation. The same government officials who had arrived at Fort Stanton with plans for forced relocations now wrote requesting guidance on how to build communities that honored diversity while maintaining stability. Diego emerged from the trading post that had become the valley's economic heart. His hair now more gray than black, but his step still strong, and his eyes still holding the kindness that had first attracted Maria so many years ago. He carried news of his own, a letter from the territorial capital announcing funding for a new school building that would serve as a regional center for multicultural education. Elena is already planning the curriculum, he reported, settling into the chair that had become his customary spot for these evening conversations. She wants to include traditional Apache plant knowledge alongside Mexican herbal medicine and whatever Tom can remember about frontier surgical techniques. Nalnish appeared from the direction of the corrals, where he had been helping care for the horses that carried visitors to and from their valley. At 7, he had grown into a sturdy, confident boy whose mixed heritage showed in his features, but whose sense of belonging had never been questioned by anyone in their community. He carried himself with the quiet dignity that had been his mother's greatest gift, combined with a practical competence that would serve him well in whatever future he chose to build. "Luna's back," he announced with the matter-of-fact tone, "children." Used for miracles they had learned to take for granted. She brought a family with her, a Mexican woman and her 3 children. They were lost in the high country for 2 days. Tahoma smiled, unsurprised by news that would have seemed impossible to accept when Luna first appeared at their cave entrance. The wolf had continued her work as a guide and protector, bringing dozens of families to safety over the year since Agent Curtis's visit had made their community officially recognized. Each rescue added to the legend that was growing around both Luna and the valley she had helped establish. As evening deepened and the first stars appeared above the canyon walls, the community gathered around the central fire pit for their weekly storytelling circle. This had become Tahoma's favorite time, when all the day's work was finished and people came together simply to share the stories that connected them across the boundaries of culture and language. Tonight, she had been asked to tell the story of their beginning, the tale of how a desperate grandmother, 2 dying children, and a mysterious wolf had found each other in the wilderness and discovered that survival required more than food and shelter. It required hope, trust, and the courage to believe that love could transform enemies into family. She began, as she always did, with the words her own grandmother had used to open the sacred stories. Long ago, when the world was younger and the spirits walked more openly among the people, there lived a woman who thought she had lost everything that mattered. The children arranged themselves closest to the fire, their faces reflecting the dancing flames as they prepared to hear a story. Many of them knew by heart, but never tired of experiencing again. Behind them sat their parents and grandparents, the adults who had made their own journeys from exile to belonging, from fear to trust, from separate survival to shared prosperity. Ayana and Nalnish flanked their grandmother, no longer the desperate, starving children who had huddled in a frozen cave, but strong, capable young people who carried both their Apache heritage and their broader community identity with equal pride. They had become living examples of what was possible when love became stronger than the forces that tried to divide people into us and them. As Tahoma spoke, weaving together the traditional phrases her ancestors had used with new details that captured their unique experience, Luna appeared at the edge of the firelight. The wolf had aged as they all had, her muzzle now touched with white and her movements slightly more careful than in their mountain climbing days. But her golden eyes still held the same patient wisdom, the same certainty that love would always find a way to guide lost souls toward home. The story concluded, as it always did, with the recognition that their rescue had been not just physical, but spiritual, a transformation that had changed not only their own lives, but the lives of everyone they had touched since accepting the wolf's guidance. As the fire burned down to glowing coals and families began to drift toward their homes, Tahoma remained in her chair with Luna beside her, looking up at the stars that had witnessed so many changes in the valley below. Tomorrow would bring new challenges, new visitors seeking the kind of healing they had found, new opportunities to prove that cooperation could triumph over conflict. But tonight, in the peace that surrounded their small community like a protective blanket, she could simply be grateful for the journey that had brought them all together. In the distance, Luna's wild pack sang their evening song, and Tahoma chose to hear it as a celebration of all the lost souls who had found their way home, and all those still searching who would someday follow the wolf tracks that led to love, acceptance, and the hope of healing in a world that had learned, finally, to choose bridges over walls.